Time has a way of bringing life full circle in Cedar Valley, where broken things have a habit of finding their way to healing. For James Morgan, fixing other people's problems had become both his escape and his burden, a way to avoid facing the cracks in his own life while providing for his young daughter. With skilled hands that could repair almost anything, he'd built a reputation as the go-to handyman in 3 counties. But on this misty autumn morning, he pulls up to what he thinks is just another job, a weather-beaten shed at Peterson Farm. As his boots crunch across fallen leaves, he doesn't realize he's about to face the one thing he never learned to fix, his past. Because Sarah Peterson isn't just any farmer, she's his first love, now transformed into one of the region's most successful agricultural entrepreneurs. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun hadn't yet touched the kitchen window when James Morgan's alarm buzzed at 5:30. He allowed himself exactly one long breath before swinging his feet onto the cold floorboards, careful to avoid the creaky spot that might wake Emma. Their small rental house, tucked at the end of Maple Street, held together mainly through his own patch jobs and determination. "Dad?" Emma's sleepy voice drifted from her bedroom just as he was measuring coffee grounds. She appeared in the doorway, her dark hair a tangled mess, still wearing the oversized NASA t-shirt he'd bought her at the Science Museum last spring. At 10 years old, she had her mother's delicate features, but his stubborn chin. And, unfortunately, his tendency to wake at the slightest sound. "Hey, sunshine, you're up early." He set the coffee filter aside and opened his arms. She shuffled over for their morning hug, a ritual neither of them had outgrown. "Another hour before school. Want to try sleeping a bit more?" Emma shook her head against his chest. "Can I help with breakfast?" The stack of bills on the counter caught his eye. Electric, gas, Emma's orthodontist, their edges curling like autumn leaves. He'd have to sort through them later, after today's jobs. "Sure. Giddo pancakes with blueberries?" Her eyes lit up. They both knew there weren't any blueberries in the fridge, but her hopeful expression made him wish he could conjure some out of thin air. "How about banana? We've got one that's perfect for pancakes." He pulled the spotted banana from the fruit bowl. "Plus I'll throw in some cinnamon, secret ingredient." As they worked together in the kitchen, Emma mashing the banana while he measured flour, his phone buzzed. Another potential job. He wiped his hands on his jeans before checking the message. "Mrs. Henderson's sink again?" Emma asked, already familiar with their regular clients. "No, actually. Someone new. Peterson Farm, out past the old Miller place, says they need shed repairs." He typed a quick confirmation while Emma added milk to their batter. "Aunt Jenny's picking you up from school today, remember? I might run late with this one. Can I come see the farm after?" There was that spark in her eyes, the one she got whenever something new came along. "Please, I finished all my homework yesterday." James smiled, pouring batter onto the hot griddle. "We'll see. Let me check out the job first, make sure it's safe." The truth was, farms meant equipment, animals, and 100 ways a curious 10-year-old could find trouble. But he also knew his sister Jenny would have her hands full with her own kids, and Emma had inherited his restless nature. The pancakes sizzled, filling their small kitchen with warmth and the smell of cinnamon. James flipped them with practiced ease, adding 2 more to the growing stack. Through the window, the sky was lightening, promising another clear autumn day. "Dad?" Emma's voice had that careful tone she used when approaching a serious subject. "Are we okay? I heard you on the phone last night talking about bills." His heart clenched. She was too young to worry about such things, but too observant to miss them. "We're just fine, sunshine." He placed a warm pancake on her plate, trying to sound more confident than he felt. "Your old dad's got plenty of work. And you know what? I heard Mrs. O'Malley might need her whole fence repainted next week. I could help." Emma brightened. "I'm getting really good at painting. Ms. Roberts said my art project was the best in class." "Is that right?" He ruffled her hair, grateful for her resilience. "Well, maybe we can work something out. But first," He tapped her plate. "Fuel for that big brain of yours." As they ate breakfast together, James mentally calculated the month's expenses against promised jobs. The Peterson Farm repair might help close the gap, especially if it led to more work in that area. He'd learned to stretch dollars like rubber bands, but sometimes even rubber bands snap. Emma chatted about her upcoming science project, gesturing with her fork as she explained the solar system mobile she planned to build. James listened, adding encouraging nods, while silently wondering if he could fashion the planets from materials in his workshop rather than buying the kit her teacher recommended. The morning slipped away like sand through his fingers. Soon Emma was brushing her teeth and he was packing her lunch, peanut butter and honey on wheat, an apple, and the last granola bar from the box. He tucked a note inside, like always. "Have an astronomical day. Love, Dad." Standing in their driveway, toolbox loaded in his truck, James watched Emma board the school bus. She waved from her window, and he waved back until the yellow vehicle disappeared around the corner. Only then did he allow his smile to fade, his shoulders to sag slightly under the weight of all he carried. The bills on the counter would have to wait. He had a shed to fix. The gravel crunched under his truck tires as James turned onto Old Mill Road, following his GPS toward Peterson Farm. The morning mist still clung to the valleys, making the countryside look like something from a painting. He'd forgotten how beautiful this part of Cedar Valley could be, having avoided these back roads for more years than he cared to count. His toolbox rattled in the passenger seat as he navigated the familiar curves, each bend stirring memories he'd rather leave undisturbed. The local paper, yellowed with age, caught his eye from where it was tucked in the truck's sun visor. He'd kept it all these years without really knowing why. A piece from 15 years ago announcing the passing of old Joe Peterson, leaving his farm to his only granddaughter. He'd glanced at it back then, filed away the information without letting himself feel its weight, and moved on with his life, or tried to. The farm's entrance appeared ahead, marked by a freshly painted sign that read, "Peterson Farms," in elegant script, the plural catching his attention. The narrow dirt road opened into a sprawling property that bore little resemblance to the modest farm he remembered from his youth. Modern silos gleamed in the morning sun, and neat rows of solar panels lined the southern field. The old farmhouse had been restored, its white paint crisp against dark shutters, with a wraparound porch that seemed to welcome visitors with open arms. James pulled up near what he assumed was the shed in question, its weathered boards a stark contrast to the well-maintained buildings around it. The structure looked like it had been transported from another time, perhaps the only thing on the property that remained unchanged from his memories. He checked his phone. 8:55 a.m. 5 minutes. Early, just as he'd planned. Professional punctuality had become his armor over the years, a way to prove his worth in a world that often judged him by his worn work boots and calloused hands. A movement caught his eye, someone walking purposefully from the main house. From this distance, he could only make out a feminine silhouette, dressed practically in work boots, jeans, and a flannel shirt, with a tablet tucked under one arm. Something about the way she moved tugged at his memory, but he pushed the thought aside. In his line of work, letting the past intrude on business was a luxury he couldn't afford. He stepped out of his truck, reaching for his toolbox. His father's toolbox, really, the leather worn smooth by 2 generations of honest work. The morning air carried the scent of fresh-cut hay and approaching autumn, along with something else. The ghost of summer evenings spent climbing through the loft of this very shed, planning futures that never came to be. "Mr. Morgan?" The voice stopped him cold, his hand still on the toolbox handle. He knew that voice, had known it once better than his own. "I'm Sarah Peterson. We spoke on the phone about the repairs." James turned slowly, 15 years of carefully constructed defenses crumbling in an instant. Sarah stood before him, time having traded her teenage softness for a confident grace. Her auburn hair was shorter now, practical rather than the long waves he remembered running his fingers through, and subtle laugh lines framed eyes that were somehow both familiar and strange as eyes at once. Recognition flickered across her face, followed by a complicated mix of emotions he couldn't or wouldn't try to read. Her hand moved unconsciously to her grandfather's pocket watch, now worn on a chain at her hip, a gesture so familiar it made his chest ache. James. His name on her lips carried 15 years of questions. He managed to find his voice, though it came out rougher than he intended. Sarah, the name Peterson I should have. You couldn't have known. She recovered more quickly than he did, professional mask sliding into place. The shed needs substantial work. Would you like to take a look? An old newspaper article's worth of history hung between them. Her grandfather's passing, the inheritance, the empire she'd built from a modest family farm. All those details he'd filed away without letting them touch him, now standing before him in flesh and blood. Of course, he heard himself say, professionalism his only refuge. That's what I'm here for. Sarah nodded, turning toward the shed. The tablet in her hands displayed what looked like architectural plans, a detail that spoke volumes about how far she'd come from the girl who used to sketch her dreams in notebooks. Her grandfather's watch caught the morning light, marking time's passage with quiet dignity. James followed, acutely aware of how his worn work clothes contrasted with the success evident in every acre of her farm. The toolbox felt heavier than usual in his grip, weighted with more than just wrenches and hammers. Each step toward the shed was a step back in time, yet firmly planted in a present he never could have imagined. Neither spoke as they approached the shed, the crunch of gravel beneath their boots filling the silence. Sarah walked half a step ahead, her grandfather's pocket watch swaying gently at her hip with each stride. The watch had been a fixture in James's memories of this place, old Joe Peterson checking it during harvest, its gold case catching the summer sun as he announced dinner time to the workers. The main structural issues are here. Sarah's voice was steady, professional, as she gestured to the shed's eastern wall. She kept her eyes fixed on the building, as if it were the most fascinating thing on her property. Water damage from a damaged gutter. The roof needs work, too. James set his toolbox down, grateful for the familiar routine of inspection. He ran his hand along the weathered boards, focusing on the rough grain of the wood, rather than the woman, standing beside him. How long has it been leaking? 2 seasons, maybe 3. She paused, then added, Things got away from me here. The farm expanded so quickly, and this, she gestured at the shed, this wasn't a priority. The unspoken words hung between them. This was just one of many things that got away. James pulled out his measuring tape, an action so automatic it was almost meditative. The foundation looks solid. That's something your grandfather got right. The words slipped out before he could catch them, opening a door he'd meant to keep closed. Sarah's hand went to the pocket watch again, her fingers tracing its worn edges. He talked about you, you know. Even years after. She let the sentence trail off, shaking her head slightly. The estimate? Should we discuss the estimate? Right. James straightened, slipping back into his professional persona. I'll need to replace most of these boards. The roof will require new supports here and here. He pointed to the compromised areas, plus proper guttering to prevent future damage. I can source reclaimed lumber that'll match the original aesthetic. If that matters. It does, actually. Something softened in her voice. Grandfather would have wanted that. Their eyes met for a moment before both looked away. Sarah pulled up something on her tablet, her fingers moving swiftly across the screen. The device seemed like an anachronism against the shed's weathered backdrop, a physical reminder of how much time had passed. I've been modernizing everything else, she continued, gesturing toward the solar panels and state-of-the-art silos. But this place, it should stay true to what it was. Within reason, of course. James nodded, understanding more than she probably meant to reveal. The shed represented something unchanged in a life that had transformed entirely. Like the pocket watch she still wore, a connection to the past she hadn't quite let go. "I can start tomorrow," he offered, keeping his tone businesslike. "2 weeks to complete, weather permitting. I'll draw up a detailed estimate tonight." "That's fine." Sarah hesitated, then added, "You should know, I've expanded operations significantly. If the work is satisfactory, there could be other repairs needed across the property." The offer hung in the air between them, heavy with implications. More work meant more time here, more moments like this, more carefully maintained professional distance that felt about as substantial as the morning mist now burning away in the strengthening sun. "I'll keep that in mind," he replied carefully. "But let's start with the shed." Sarah nodded, her professional mask firmly back in place. "Of course. I'll need your insurance information and—" Her tablet slipped in her grasp, and James reached out instinctively to steady it. Their fingers brushed, a momentary contact that sent electricity shooting up his arm. "Sorry," they both said at once, then shared an awkward laugh that felt like stepping into an old familiar room. "You can email the paperwork," Sarah said quickly, taking a step back. "The address is on the website now, petersonfarms.com. We've grown quite a bit since—" She gestured vaguely at the surrounding property. "I can see that." James picked up his toolbox, its weight a comforting anchor to the present. "You've done well for yourself, Sarah." Something flickered across her face, pride mixed with something else, something that might have been regret. Her hand went to the pocket watch one more time, an unconscious tell he remembered from years ago. "Yes, well, tomorrow then?" "Tomorrow," he confirmed, turning back toward his truck. He could feel her eyes on him as he walked away and fought the urge to look back. The gravel crunched under his boots, each step a reminder that he was leaving as a contractor, nothing more. But as he drove away, the image of Sarah's hand on her grandfather's watch stayed with him, ticking away the minutes between what was and what could have been. The next morning arrived with a chill that hinted at winter's approach. James pulled up to the Peterson farm, just as the sun was climbing above the silos, casting long shadows across the frosted ground. He'd spent half the night working on the estimate, trying to keep his mind on numbers and materials rather than memories. Sarah was already there, leaning against her truck near the shed. She'd traded yesterday's tablet for work gloves and a thermos, looking more like the farm girl he'd known than the business owner he'd met yesterday. "Morning," she called, her breath visible in the cold air. "Coffee?" He hesitated before accepting the offered cup. The thermos was new, sleek stainless steel, but the coffee inside tasted exactly the same, strong and sweet, the way her grandfather had always made it. "Still take it with 2 sugars?" she asked, and he nodded, surprised she remembered. "Some things don't change," he said, then immediately regretted it as tension crept back into her shoulders. "Let's look at the interior," she suggested, moving toward the shed's doors. They protested with a familiar creak as she pulled them open. Sunlight streamed through gaps in the wallboards, dust motes dancing in the golden beams. The air inside smelled of old wood and hay, overlaid with the musty scent of rain damage. James moved methodically, testing boards and joints, marking problems in his notebook. But every corner held a memory. There was the back wall where they'd hidden during hide-and-seek games as kids. The high beam where they'd carved their initials one summer night, drunk on youth and possibility. He wondered if Sarah remembered, if she ever looked up at that small mark of defiance against time. "The support beam here is compromised," he said, pointing to a dark patch of water damage. "We'll need to—" He stopped as his flashlight beam caught something familiar. Their initials, J+S, still visible after all these years, partially hidden beneath an old board. Sarah had seen it too. She stepped closer, reaching up to brush away years of dust with a gloved hand. "I'd forgotten about that," she said softly. "Dad was so mad when he found out we'd carved into his new lumber." "Your grandfather thought it was funny, though," James found himself saying. "Told him young love was worth a scarred beam or two." The words hung in the air between them, heavy as the dust motes in the sunlight. Sarah's hand dropped from the carving, and she turned away, moving toward the far corner of the shed. "What about this section?" she asked, voice professional again. "The flooding was worst here during spring rains?" James followed, grateful for the return to business. "The grade of the land has shifted. Water pools here instead of draining away. We'll need to adjust the foundation slightly and install proper drainage." He walked her through the technical details, keeping his focus on the work ahead rather than the past carved into the walls around them. Sarah asked intelligent questions about materials and techniques, demonstrating knowledge that surprised him. "You know a lot about construction," he observed during a pause in their discussion. She shrugged, but he caught a hint of pride in her expression. "Had to learn. Running a farm this size means understanding every aspect of the operation. Can't rely on others to know what you don't." "Is that what your grandfather used to say?" "No," she smiled slightly. "That's what I learned on my own." She pulled off her gloves, tucking them into her back pocket. "The farm taught me a lot of things grandfather couldn't." James nodded, understanding. They'd both learned lessons the hard way over the years. "I'll start with the drainage work today," he said. "Need to fix that before we can address the structural issues." "Of course." Sarah moved toward the door, then paused. "James, those initials, I can have them covered when you replace the beam, if you think that would be best." He looked up at the carving again, remembering the young man who'd stood on a rickety ladder, pocket knife in hand, certain that some things would last forever. "Your call," he said finally. "It's your shed." Sarah's hand went to her grandfather's. Watch that unconscious gesture he was starting to recognize again. "Let me know when you're ready to make that decision," she said quietly, and walked out into the morning sun. James stood alone in the shed for a moment longer, surrounded by the ghosts of summer evenings and whispered promises. Then he picked up his tools and got to work. The past might be carved into these walls, but the present had drainage issues to solve. James spent the morning digging drainage trenches, the physical labor a welcome distraction from his thoughts. Around noon, the sound of approaching vehicles drew his attention. A line of trucks bearing the Peterson Farm's logo pulled up to the main building, where workers began unloading crates of produce. "Local restaurant deliveries," Sarah's voice came from behind him. She'd changed into more business-like attire, dark jeans, a crisp blue button-down, and boots that looked more suitable for boardrooms than barns. "We supply most of the farm-to-table restaurants in 3 counties now." James straightened, wiping sweat from his forehead with his sleeve. "Quite an operation you've built. Would you like to see?" The invitation seemed to surprise them both. "I mean, you should probably understand the full scope of the property in case there's other work needed." He nodded, setting his shovel aside. Sarah led him toward the main building, which he now realized was a sophisticated processing facility. Through large windows, he could see workers sorting and packaging produce with modern efficiency. "We started small," Sarah explained as they walked, "just delivering to a few local places, but I had this idea about combining traditional farming with modern distribution methods." She pressed her keycard against a sensor, leading him into an office that overlooked the operation floor. The wall behind her desk was covered in awards and certifications. Outstanding Agricultural Innovation, Business Leader of the Year, Sustainable Farming Excellence. Each plaque and frame told the story of her success, of dreams that had grown beyond their teenage imaginings. "Grandfather's farm was beautiful," Sarah said, moving to stand by the window, "but it was dying. Small farms couldn't compete anymore, not without adapting." She turned to face him. "Everyone said I was crazy to invest in solar panels and hydroponics, taking on that much debt, changing everything he'd built. But you proved them wrong," James observed, studying a recent magazine cover featuring Sarah standing proudly in front of her solar array. "Not everyone. The bank almost foreclosed 3 years in. I lived on ramen noodles and coffee, worked 18-hour days." She smiled slightly. "Pretty sure I still have the final warning notice somewhere, framed next to the first profit statement." James thought of his own stack of bills at home, of Emma's hopeful face asking about blueberry pancakes. "You took a risk. It paid off." It did. Sarah's hand went to her grandfather's watch. But some days I wonder if he'd recognize the place now, if he'd understand why I had to change so much. He'd be proud, James said quietly. Anyone would be. Sarah turned to him, really looking at him for the first time since they'd entered her office. And you? Are you still doing what you love? The question caught him off guard. He thought of his early dreams of becoming an architect, plans derailed by life's complications. I'm doing what I'm good at, he answered finally. It puts food on the table. Something flickered in Sarah's eyes, recognition perhaps, or concern. She moved to her desk, picking up a folder. Speaking of which, I've been reviewing your estimate for the shed. It's very reasonable, but I think we should discuss a larger contract. The north barn needs work, and the guest house could use updating. She handed him the folder. If you're interested. James opened it, scanning the proposal. Inside, the figures made his breath catch. It was more work than he'd seen in months, maybe years. This is fair market value for the work needed, Sarah said firmly. I've done my research. You have the skills, and I need someone who understands old buildings, who knows their history. She paused. Someone who cares about doing it right. He looked up from the folder to find her watching him intently. Why me, Sarah? There are bigger companies, ones with crews and equipment. Because you're still doing what you're good at, she said softly. Even if it's not what you planned. The moment stretched between them, full of unspoken understanding. Through the window, workers continued their efficient dance of sorting and packing, the modern face of her success. Behind her desk, the awards glinted in the afternoon sun, each one a milestone on her journey from inheritance to empire. I'll need to review this properly, he said finally, holding up the folder. Work out a timeline. Sarah nodded, professional mask sliding back into place. Of course, take your time. She moved toward the door, then stopped. James, for what it's worth, I think you're good at a lot more than you give yourself credit. For? He watched her walk away, the folder heavy in his hands. Through the window, he could see the old shed waiting for his return, its weathered boards a stark contrast to the gleaming facility around him. Two worlds, he thought, and he wasn't sure which one he belonged in anymore. The sound of tires on gravel pulled James from his concentration. He'd spent the afternoon replacing rotted boards, trying not to think about Sarah's proposal waiting in his truck. Looking up, he saw Jenny's minivan approaching, Emma's face pressed, eagerly against the passenger window. Dad! Emma burst out of the car before it fully stopped. This place is huge. Are those real solar panels and silos? Can we see inside them? Jenny stepped out more slowly, taking in the sprawling farm. Sorry, James. She wouldn't stop talking about visiting, and you know how she gets. It's fine, he said, though his stomach tightened as he saw Sarah emerging from the main building, drawn by the commotion. Emma stopped mid-bounce, suddenly shy as Sarah approached. James watched the two of them see each other for the first time, struck by the strange intersection of his past and present. You must be Emma, Sarah said warmly. I'm Sarah. This is my farm. You have solar panels, Emma stated, as if this was the highest possible achievement. Sarah laughed, a genuine sound that made James's chest ache. I do. Would you like to learn how they work? Emma's eyes widened. Can I? Dad, can I? James glanced at Jenny, who shrugged and checked her watch. I can pick her up in an hour. The twins have soccer at 5. Before James could respond, Sarah stepped in. I can drive her home later, if that's easier. We were just about to test the new hydroponic system. It's basically a science experiment. Emma looked like she might explode from excitement. Please, Dad. Please, it's just like my science project. James found himself nodding, powerless, against the combined enthusiasm of his daughter and Sarah. Just don't touch anything without permission, he called, as Emma practically skipped after Sarah toward the main building. Jenny watched them go, then turned to him with raised eyebrows. Sarah? As in? Yeah, he said quietly. As in, James. His sister's voice held a mix of concern and curiosity. It's just work, Jenny. The shed needs repairs. She studied him for a moment longer, then sighed. All right, call if you need anything. She squeezed his arm before leaving, the minivan kicking up dust as it disappeared down the drive. For the next hour, James tried to focus on his work, but his attention kept drifting to the main building. Through the windows, he could see Emma and Sarah moving between rows of hydroponic lettuce, his daughter clutching a notebook, scribbling frantically as Sarah explained something with animated gestures. When they finally emerged, Emma's face was flushed with excitement. She ran to where James was packing up his tools, waving a piece of paper. "Dad, look what I drew. Sarah showed me how the whole farm works, and I drew a diagram, and she said I could use it for my science project." The drawing was surprisingly detailed for a 10-year-old. The solar panels, the hydroponic systems, even the delivery trucks, all carefully labeled with Emma's neat handwriting. In one corner, she'd drawn two figures, a small girl and a tall woman, both smiling. "She knows everything about science, Dad," Emma continued breathlessly. "And she said I asked really good questions. And she showed me how they track the produce with computers. And did you know they supply all the fancy restaurants? And she has a whole wall of awards in her office." "Sounds like you had fun," James managed, watching Sarah approach more slowly. "She's brilliant," Sarah said, reaching them. "You've got a future agricultural scientist on your hands." Emma beamed at the praise. "Can I come back tomorrow? Sarah said they're testing soil samples." "Emma," James started, but Sarah interrupted gently. "Actually, I could use a research assistant. If it's okay with your dad, maybe you could help. Me after school sometimes? We could work on your science project too." The hope in Emma's eyes was almost painful to see. She turned to James, practically vibrating with anticipation. "Please, Dad, I'll be super careful, and I'll still do all my homework, and—" "We'll talk about it," James said, which both of them knew probably meant yes. "For now, we should head home. It's getting late." Emma hugged her diagram to her chest, then surprised everyone by throwing her arms around Sarah's waist. "Thank you for showing me everything." Sarah's hand hovered for a moment before settling on Emma's hair, her expression soft and something else, wistful maybe. "Thank you for your excellent questions." As they walked to his truck, Emma chattered non-stop about hydroponics and solar power and how Sarah was the coolest person ever. James helped her buckle in, her precious diagram held carefully on her lap. When he looked back, Sarah was still standing there, watching them leave. In the fading light, with his daughter's excited voice filling the cab, he could almost imagine a different version of this moment, one where the past 15 years had gone differently. But Emma was already asking about dinner, and the stack of bills waited at home, and Sarah's business proposal sat heavy in his bag. The present, he reminded himself, had its own demands to meet. The weather changed 3 days later. James arrived at the farm early, hoping to finish the roof repairs before the weekend, only to find Sarah on the porch of the main house, her grandfather's old weather radio crackling with static beside her. "Storm's coming," she said without preamble. "A big one. They're saying possible tornadoes west of here." Her fingers drummed anxiously on the radio's worn casing. "I've got 3 fields of late harvest vegetables that need to be secured." James studied the horizon. The clouds were still distant, but he recognized the sickly green tint to the sky. Growing up in Cedar Valley taught you to read the weather like a book. "How long? 4 hours, maybe 5. Sarah ran a hand through her hair, already escaping its practical ponytail. "I've called in everyone I can, but half my crew's at the farmer's market in Madison." The decision formed before he fully considered it. "I'll help." Sarah turned to him, surprise evident on her face. "James, you don't have to. Emma's with Jenny until evening. I've got time." He was already heading to his truck. "Just tell me where you need me." For a moment, Sarah looked like she might argue. Then the radio crackled again with another warning, and she nodded. "The north field first. We need to get the row covers secured." They worked steadily through the morning, the air growing heavier with each passing hour. James followed Sarah's, efficient directions, helping to stake down protective covers over delicate crops. Other workers arrived in ones and twos, immediately joining the race against the weather. The old weather radio, now perched on Sarah's truck hood, continued its steady stream of updates. The sound transported James back to summers, spent watching old Joe Peterson adjust the dial, predicting rain or shine with an accuracy that seemed like magic to a young boy. "He swore by this thing," Sarah said, catching his glance at the radio. She wiped sweat from her forehead, leaving a smudge of dirt. "Said it was more reliable than any fancy weather app." Looks like he was right. James secured another stake, feeling the wind starting to pick up. It's still working after all these years. Sarah's hand brushed the radio's scratched surface. "Some old things are worth keeping." The double meaning hung in the air between them, but a crack of thunder interrupted any response. The storm was moving faster than predicted. "We need to get the equipment under cover," Sarah called out to her workers, already moving toward the tractors. The wind was stronger now, whipping her hair free of its tie completely. James joined the scramble to secure everything that could become a projectile. Rain started to fall as they worked, fat drops that promised worse to come. Through the growing storm, he watched Sarah direct her crew with calm efficiency, calling out instructions and helping wherever needed. This was a different Sarah than the polished businesswoman in her award-filled office. This was the farmer's granddaughter who'd learned every inch of this land, who knew exactly how to protect it. In the grey stormlight, she looked more familiar than she had since he'd returned. The rain was falling in sheets by the time they got the last tractor under cover. Lightning split the sky, followed immediately by thunder that shook the ground. "Everyone go home," Sarah shouted over the storm. "Be safe." Workers ran for their vehicles, wipers already on full as they navigated the drive. James turned to his own truck, but Sarah caught his arm. "The shed," she yelled. "The new drainage. We need to make sure it's holding." She was right. All his work would be tested by this downpour. They ran together through the rain, boots slipping in the mud. The wind tried to tear the shed door from their grasp as they pulled it open. Inside, water was already seeping under the old walls, but the new drainage channels were doing their job, directing the flow away from the foundation. Sarah pulled out her phone's flashlight, checking the corners. There, she pointed to where water was pooling near the back wall. "Something's blocked!" They worked together without speaking, clearing debris from the channel, shoulders bumping in the dim light. James tried not to notice how close they were, how familiar her presence felt even after all these years. A massive crack of thunder made them both jump. Sarah's flashlight beam caught the carved initials on the beam above them, and for a moment neither moved. "James," Sarah said softly, barely audible over the storm. But before she could continue, her phone buzzed urgently. "The hydroponics building," she read, face illuminated by the screen. "The backup generator isn't engaging." They looked at each other, the moment broken. "Go," James said. "I'll finish here." Sarah hesitated just a second before nodding and running back into the storm. James watched her go, then turned back to the drainage channel. The past could wait. Right now, there was work to be done. But as he worked, the old weather radio's warnings echoing from Sarah's truck outside, he couldn't help but wonder if some storms were meant to clear away more than just the summer heat. The storm grew fiercer, making it impossible to leave the shed. James had finished clearing the drainage channels, but the wind howled too strongly to risk opening the heavy doors. Sarah had returned from the hydroponics building, soaked but satisfied that the backup systems were functioning. They sat on old crates near the back wall, listening to the rain hammer the roof. Sarah had found an emergency lantern in a cabinet, its soft glow creating islands of light in the shadowy space. Between them sat a dusty photo album, discovered while searching for the lantern. "I can't believe Grandfather kept this out here," Sarah said, carefully opening the worn cover. The first photo showed a much younger Joe Peterson standing proudly in front of the shed, then newly built. "He used to say the shed was the heart of the farm," James remembered. "Everything important passed through here at some point." Sarah's fingers traced the edge of the photograph. He wasn't wrong. I learned to drive a tractor right outside these doors. Had my first kiss behind that wall. She paused, glancing at James. Well, you remember that part. I remember being terrified your grandfather would catch us. The admission brought a small smile to both their faces. Lightning flashed. Outside, followed by a deep rumble of thunder. Sarah jumped slightly, then tried to cover it with a laugh. Still not fond of storms. Still counting between lightning and thunder? James asked, remembering how she used to track the storm's distance. Sometimes. She turned another page in the album. Emma's afraid of them too. I could tell from how she talked about the weather unit in her science class. James looked at her sharply. She didn't mention that to me. Kids often don't tell their parents what scares them. They want to seem brave. Sarah's voice was gentle. She's a remarkable girl, James. You've done well with her. I'm doing my best, he said quietly. Some days that doesn't feel like enough. Is that why you never... Sarah hesitated, then continued. Why you never pursued architecture? Emma mentioned you help her design buildings for her video games. The question hit closer to home than he expected. Life had other plans. Emma's mother left when she was 2. Someone had to keep a roof over our heads, food on the table. Dreams don't pay bills. No, Sarah said softly. But sometimes they find other ways to come true. She turned another page, revealing a photo of teenage James helping old Joe repair the shed's roof. Look at you, already fixing things, already falling in love, he said without thinking, remembering how he used to volunteer for any farm job that meant seeing Sarah. The words hung in the air between them, heavy as the storm clouds outside. Sarah's hand went to her grandfather's watch, a nervous gesture he'd been noticing more frequently. James, about how things ended. We don't have to do this, he interrupted. It was a long time ago. Maybe we do. Sarah closed the album. Carefully. I got the acceptance letter to Cornell that morning. Full scholarship, everything I'd worked for, everything grandfather had dreamed of for me. But when I came to tell you, I was already gone. James remembered that morning with painful clarity. My dad's heart attack, the medical bills, the foreclosure notice, everything falling apart at once. You could have told me. And what? Asked you to give up your future. Watch you resent me as you gave up Cornell to help save my family's house? He shook his head. You deserved better than that. I deserved to make my own choice. There was an edge to Sarah's voice now. Instead, I got a note. Don't wait for me. That's all you left? I was 18 and drowning, watching my father in the hospital, watching our house slip away. I couldn't drag you down with me, so you made the decision for both of us. Sarah stood, pacing the small space. Do you know what grandfather said when I finally came home? That a night? He said, sometimes love means letting people find their own way back. James felt the weight of those words of 15 years of separate paths. He was a wise man. He also said I was as stubborn as my grandmother, and that good things grow back stronger after being pruned. Sarah stopped pacing, looking down at him. The storm's passing. She was right. The thunder had grown distant, the rain softening to a gentle patter. The moment of forced honesty was ending with the storm. I should check the drainage again, James said, standing. Always practical. Sarah's voice held a mix of affection and frustration. Some things really don't change. But as they moved to open the shed doors, she paused. Emma's science project. She'll need to come back to complete her research. Sarah, and the North Barn still needs evaluation for the contract. She held his gaze. I'm not 18 anymore, James. Neither are you. Maybe it's time we both stopped letting the past make our decisions. The storm had cleared enough to see the sunset painting the wet fields in gold. Sarah stepped out into the fresh-washed evening, leaving James to watch her go. The photo album, a silent witness to everything said and unsaid. Dawn revealed the storm's impact across Peterson Farm. James arrived early, the morning sun casting long shadows across puddle-strewn grounds. The fields looked like lakes in the golden light, row covers rippling in the gentle breeze that had replaced yesterday's fury. He found Sarah by their old meeting spot, a broken fence post that had once marked the boundary between grazing pasture and cornfield. She stood with her tablet in hand, but her attention was on the sunrise painting. The wet fields in amber and rose. "The drainage held," she said without turning. "You did good work." "Damage assessment? Could have been worse." She finally looked at him, dark circles under her eyes, suggesting she'd been up most of the night. "Lost some of the late tomatoes, but the hydroponic system stayed online. The crews are already working on debris cleanup." James studied the broken fence post, weathered wood telling its own story of time's passage. "This needs replacing." "I know." Sarah's lips curved slightly. "I've had plenty of offers to fix it over the years, somehow never got around to it." The weight of memory hung between them, fresh after last night's conversations. James remembered summer evenings spent sitting on that fence, planning futures that seemed as bright as the sunrise before them. "About last night," he started. "The North Barn," Sarah interrupted. "All business now. I need your assessment before the insurance adjusters arrive at 9. Storm damage might have compromised the structural integrity." The abrupt shift to professional matters was almost a relief. They walked together toward the barn, boots squelching in mud, maintaining a careful distance that felt more habitual than natural now. The old barn stood stalwart against the morning sky, its red paint faded but proud. Inside, sunshine streamed through gaps in the roof boards, highlighting dancing dust motes and patches of water damage. James moved methodically, testing joints and supports, while Sarah made notes on her tablet. "The main beam's solid," he reported, running a hand along aged wood. "But these support posts—" He stopped, noticing something odd. "Sarah, come look at this." She joined him, tablet forgotten. At her side, there, half hidden behind a support post, was a small wooden box he recognized instantly. Old Joe Peterson's repair kit, used for emergency fixes during harvest season. Sarah reached for it with slightly trembling hands. "I thought this was lost years ago, after the renovation." The box opened with a familiar creak. Inside, tools lay nestled in worn velvet, a hammer, screwdrivers, wrench, and a collection of nails and screws, each in its designated place. At the bottom, a folded piece of paper had yellowed with age. "His notes," Sarah said softly, carefully unfolding it. "He used to keep records of every repair, every change to the farm." Her finger traced her grandfather's flowing script. "Look, at this entry, June 15th, helped young James fix the tractor. Boys got good hands and a better heart. Sarah could do worse." James felt his throat tighten. He always did see more than he let on. He saw everything. Sarah closed the box gently. "The way you looked at me when you thought no one was watching. The way I made excuses to be wherever you were working." She met his eyes. "The way we both tried to hide how much it hurt when you left." "Sarah." "No, let me finish." She set the box aside, squaring her shoulders. "Last night, in the shed, you said you couldn't drag me down with you. But did you ever think that maybe I was strong enough to lift us both up? That maybe we could have faced it together?" The morning sun caught her grandfather's watch as she spoke, glinting off its worn face. James thought of Emma's excitement, about the farm, of Sarah's careful notes about his work, of all the ways the past refused to stay buried. "We can't change what happened," he said finally. "No." Sarah picked up her tablet again, professional mask slipping back into place. "But we can learn from it. The insurance adjusters will want to see the upper level. Shall we?" As they climbed to the barn's second floor, James carried old Joe's repair kit, its familiar weight a reminder of skills learned and choices made. The morning light streamed through the barn boards in golden bars, illuminating their path forward, one careful step at a time. The Cedar Valley diner hadn't changed in 15 years. The same vinyl booths, the same coffee-stained menus, the same bell that chimed whenever the door opened. James sat in his usual corner booth, waiting for Emma to finish her chocolate milk, when he overheard the whispers. "Peterson girl hired him special," Mrs. Henderson was saying to anyone who'd listen. "Wouldn't let anyone else touch that old shed of Joe's." Always knew they'd find their way back, Betty, the long-time waitress, added as she refilled coffee cups. Some things are just meant to be. Emma looked up from her glass, dark eyes curious. Dad, how come everyone keeps talking about you and Miss Peterson? James focused on his coffee, buying time. The diner's menu sat between them, its laminated surface showing years of wear, just like his carefully constructed explanations. Small towns have long memories, sunshine. But you knew her before, when you were young. The bell chimed, and as if summoned by their conversation, Sarah walked in. She'd clearly come straight from the fields, dressed in work clothes with dirt smudging her cheek. The diner's usual chatter dimmed momentarily, then swelled with poorly concealed interest. Miss Peterson! Emma waved enthusiastically before James could stop her. We saved you a seat. Sarah hesitated, then approached their booth. Emma, Mr. Morgan. The formality felt strange after the storm's revelations. I just came for coffee. Dad always says diner coffee tastes better with company, Emma announced, sliding deeper into the booth to make room. Her hopeful expression was impossible to resist. Sarah sat, something softening in her face as Betty appeared with a coffee cup without being asked. Some things never change, she murmured, nodding thanks to the waitress. Like the menu, James offered, trying to keep things light. Still can't believe they charge extra for maple syrup, or that they still serve grandfather's favorite hot roast beef sandwich with extra gravy. Sarah smiled at the memory. He'd drive into town every Thursday, regular as clockwork. Emma leaned forward, eager for any story about the past. Did you come here too, when you were my age? I did. Sarah's fingers traced the menu's worn edge. Your dad and I used to split the apple pie after school. 1 slice, 2 forks. The diner seemed to hold its breath, dozens of ears straining to catch every word. James could feel the weight of community expectation pressing in on their small booth. We should order pie, Emma declared. For research. Dad says you always need to research history properly. Sarah's laugh surprised them both. Your dad would say that. He used to help me study for history tests right here in this booth. She glanced at James. Until he started teaching me instead about load-bearing walls and proper foundation techniques. Really? Emma's eyes lit up. Dad never told me he taught anyone. He was good at it. Sarah met his gaze over her coffee cup. Patient, thorough, made everything seem possible. The conversations around them had gone suspiciously quiet. James could practically feel Mrs. Henderson's eyes burning into the back of his head. Emma, he said carefully, why don't you go ask Betty about that pie? Once Emma was out of earshot, Sarah spoke softly. I didn't mean to stir up gossip. In Cedar Valley, gossip stirs itself. He attempted a smile. Besides, you're the talk of the town already. Local girl made good, running the biggest farm operation in 3 counties. Local girl, Sarah repeated, a hint of challenge in her voice. Is that how you see me? Before he could answer, Emma returned triumphantly with a slice of apple pie. And 3 forks. Betty says it's on the house for old time's sake. The pie looked exactly the same. Golden crust, cinnamon-flecked filling, a scoop of vanilla ice cream melting at its peak. Sarah accepted her fork with a small smile, and for a moment the years seemed to fold in on themselves. This is nice, Emma declared between bites. We should do research more often. The bell chimed again as more customers entered. The news of Sarah Peterson sharing pie with James Morgan, sure to spread through town before sunset. But watching Emma happily divide the pie into careful portions, James found he didn't mind the attention as much as he'd expected. Some things, after all, were worth remembering. James found the envelope on his truck's windshield early Monday morning. The Peterson Farm's letterhead was crisp and professional, a far cry from the notebook paper notes they'd once passed in high school. Inside, the job offer was laid out in clear terms: facilities manager, full benefits, salary that made his breath catch. Sarah stood in the doorway of her office, watching him read. She'd dressed for business today, charcoal blazer, pressed slacks, leather portfolio under one arm. Only her boots, still dusty from morning rounds, betrayed the farmer beneath the CEO. "It's a real position," she said before he could speak. "One I've needed to fill for months. The storm proved that." James looked up from the letter. "Sarah, the benefits package includes health insurance, dental too." Her voice was carefully neutral. "And there's an education savings provision for dependents." The mention of Emma's future hit him like a physical blow. He thought of college funds that remained stubbornly empty, of opportunities slipping away with each passing year. "You don't have to do this." "No?" Sarah moved closer, every inch the confident businesswoman. "My operation's growing. I need someone who understands both the old structures and the new systems, someone who can bridge that gap." She paused. "Someone who already knows the heart of this place." James scanned the letter again, noting the detailed job description. Maintenance supervision, renovation planning, project management, everything he'd once dreamed of doing wrapped in a different package. "And Emma?" he asked quietly. "The house that comes with the position is near the hydroponics building. Easy walk to the school bus stop." Sarah's hand went to her grandfather's watch. "She could still help with research after school if she wants. The science program here could use young minds." The future unfolded in his imagination. Emma growing up with space to run, learning about sustainable farming, having opportunities he'd never dared hope for. But beneath the practical considerations lay deeper currents. "The town's already talking," he said. "Let them." Sarah set her portfolio down, something softening in her stance. "James, I'm not offering this because of our history. I'm offering it because you're the right person for the job. Everything else, that's up to us to figure out." She pulled another document from her portfolio. "Here's the current maintenance budget. Review it, ask questions, take time to decide." Her professional mask slipped slightly. "Just don't take 15 years this time." The slight tremor in her voice betrayed the businesslike exterior. James remembered her words from the barn. "Maybe I was strong enough to lift us both up." "I'll need to think about it," he said finally. "Talk to Emma." Sarah nodded, composure restored. "Of course. I have meetings in Madison the next few days. You can let me know next week." But as she turned to leave, she stopped. "You know what grandfather used to say about second chances?" James shook his head. "He said they're like winter wheat. They look dead and buried, but given time and the right conditions, they grow stronger than before." She smiled slightly. He was always better with farming metaphors than business proposals. The job offer felt heavy in James's hands, weighted with more than just paper and ink. Through the window, he could see the shed where they'd sheltered. From the storm, the barn they'd inspected together, the fields stretching toward possibilities he'd long ago stopped considering. "Sarah," he called as she reached the door, "your grandfather, he would have loved what you've built here." She touched the watch at her hip, a gesture so familiar it ached. "Maybe, but he also would have said some things are worth more than just building." With that, she was gone, leaving James alone with an offer that promised to change more than just his employment status. He carefully folded the letter, placing it in his chest pocket. The future, it seemed, had arrived in a business envelope, bringing with it chances he'd thought long lost in the storm of youth and circumstance. The old yearbook lay open on Sarah's desk, its pages faded but carefully preserved. Emma sat cross-legged in the office chair, completely absorbed in the photographs, while James leaned against the doorframe, torn between discomfort and amusement. "You had so much hair," Emma giggled, pointing at a photo of teenage James at a school football game. "And look at Miss Peterson's glasses." "They were very fashionable at the time," Sarah defended, perching on the edge of her desk. She'd been surprised when Emma asked about their high school days, but the yearbook had appeared from a drawer without hesitation. "Were you really on the science team together?" Emma's finger traced the caption under a group photo. "Dad, you never told me you liked science." "Your father," Sarah said, sharing a knowing look with James, "was the only reason I passed physics. He used to explain everything using building metaphors." "Really?" Emma's eyes lit up. "Like what?" Sarah smiled. "Remembering. Well, when we were studying forces, he explained tension and compression using the shed's roof beams, or how he taught me about mechanical advantage using the old hay pulley system, which you then used in your science fair project, James added. First place, as I recall. You remember that? Hard to forget. You were so excited you knocked over the display model. They shared a laugh, years falling away for a moment. Emma watched them with keen interest, a detective piecing together clues. Is that why you kept the shed? She asked Sarah. Because of the science lessons. The question caught them both off guard. Sarah's hand went to her grandfather's watch, that telling gesture James had come to expect. Partly, she admitted. Some things are worth keeping even if they need a little repair now and then. Emma nodded sagely. Like how Dad fixed Mrs. Henderson's porch swing because it reminded her of her husband. James pushed off from the doorframe, suddenly needing to move. The job offer, he said to Sarah. Emma should know about it. Know about what? Emma straightened in the chair, attention captured. Sarah closed the yearbook gently. I've asked your father to come work here, full time. There's a house that goes with the position, closer to your school. We'd live here? On the farm? Emma's voice rose with excitement. Near the hydroponics lab? It's not decided yet, James cautioned. There's a lot to consider. But Dad! Emma jumped up, yearbook forgotten. We could help with the soil samples and learn about the solar panels, and she stopped suddenly, looking between them. Would it be weird? Because you used to be friends. We're still friends, Sarah said carefully. Sometimes friends just need time to remember that. Emma considered this with all the gravity a 10-year-old could muster. Like in my book about the baby turtle, how it had to go away to grow, but it came back to the same beach. James felt his throat tighten. Leave it to his daughter to sum. Up 15 years in a children's book metaphor. Something like that, he managed. Emma turned back to the yearbook, flipping pages until she found what she was looking for. Here, Dad, you wrote something in Ms. Peterson's yearbook. Can I read it? I don't, James started, but Sarah was already nodding. Sarah, Emma read carefully. Remember me when you're winning Nobel Prizes and changing the world. Someone has to build the labs where you'll make your discoveries. Maybe if I study hard enough. She looked up. The rest is faded. Sarah's fingers brushed the page gently. I remember what it said. Maybe if I study hard enough, I'll be the one to build them. The silence that followed felt heavy with might-have-beens. James thought of architectural dreams set aside, of Sarah's modern facility with its careful planning, of paths diverging, and possibly converging again. Dad, Emma's voice was quieter now. Did you want to build things, not just fix them? Once upon a time, he said softly. But sometimes life has other plans. Or maybe, Sarah said, looking at him over their daughter's head, sometimes plans just take longer than we expect. Emma closed the yearbook carefully, hugging it to her chest. I think, she announced with certainty, the baby turtle had the right idea about coming home. James met Sarah's eyes across the desk, seeing in them the same mix of hope and hesitation he felt. The yearbook in Emma's arms held their past, but the future, their future, was still unwritten. The breakdown couldn't have come at a worse time. Sarah's main harvester ground to a halt in the middle of the east field, a crucial component failing during the peak of harvest season. The replacement part would take 3 days to arrive. Days they didn't have with rain in the forecast. James heard the news from one of the workers while finishing the shed's roof. He found Sarah in the equipment barn, staring at the harvester's diagnostic screen with the kind of intensity that spoke of mounting desperation. 3 days, she said without looking up. Everything we've worked for this season, and it comes down to 3 days. The broken component sat on the workbench, a custom-manufactured piece that helped regulate the harvester's processing system. Modern farming equipment was a far cry from the tractors he'd learned to fix in his youth. Let me look at it, he said, picking up the damaged part. Sarah ran a hand through her hair, exhaustion evident in her stance. James, this isn't a loose belt or a worn gasket. It's a proprietary component. The manufacturer won't warranty the harvester if we use anything but their parts. But James was already examining the piece, turning it over in his hands, mind working through possibilities. The basic principle hasn't changed since your grandfather's day. It's just more efficient now, more precise. He looked up at her. Do you still have the old fabrication workshop? The one where Joe used to make replacement parts? Understanding dawned in her eyes. Behind the old corn crib, but it hasn't been used in years. Show me. The workshop was dusty but intact. Tools hung on the walls just as James remembered. The metal lathe and milling machine covered in protective tarps. This had been old Joe's sanctuary, where he'd taught James that understanding how things worked was just as important as knowing how to fix them. Your grandfather never threw away a tool he might need again, James said, uncovering the equipment. He used to say, "Everything breaks, but nothing's truly broken," Sarah finished. I remember. They worked through the afternoon and into the evening, James mapping out the component specifications, while Sarah called up technical diagrams on her tablet. The contrast between old-world craftsmanship and modern technology wasn't lost on either of them. "Hand me that caliper," James said, focused on the measurements. "The digital one." Sarah reached for the tool, then paused. "Wait." She went to a cabinet in the corner, pulling out an old wooden box. Inside lay her grandfather's precision tools, including an analog caliper that James recognized instantly. "More accurate than digital," she said softly. "That's what he always claimed." James took the tool, its weight familiar in his hands. He wasn't wrong. As the sun set, they fabricated a replacement part that merged old-world precision with modern requirements. James machined the main component while Sarah handled the electronic sensors that would allow it to communicate with the harvester's computer. "It's not certified," she warned as they prepared to test it. "If it fails, it won't." James's certainty surprised them both. "Trust me." The harvester's engine rumbled to life, computer systems booting up. Sarah held her breath as the diagnostics ran, her grandfather's watch glinting in the barn's fluorescent lights. Green lights flashed across the screen. The machine hummed with healthy power. "How did you know?" Sarah asked, staring at the readout in disbelief. "Your grandfather taught me more than just repairs. He taught me to understand the soul of a machine." James wiped grease from his hands. "Some lessons stick with you." Sarah touched the fabricated part gently, feeling the precision of its craftsmanship. "This is why I need you here," she said quietly. "Not just for repairs, but for solutions, for understanding both where we've been and where we're going." Their eyes met over the humming harvester, the air between them charged with more than just machinery. "The warranty," James started, "can be renewed. The harvest can't." Sarah straightened. "Decision made. I'm calling in the crews. We work through the night, get everything in before the rain." James nodded, already reaching for his tools. Some decisions, like some repairs, meant taking calculated risks. As the harvester rolled back into the fields, its lights illuminating the darkness, he thought about old Joe's workshop and Sarah's modern farm, about bridges between past and future, about things broken and things rebuilt. Sometimes the strongest fixes were the ones that honored both what was and what could be. Emma's wish list appeared on the kitchen table one morning, written in her careful handwriting on blue notebook paper. James found it next to his coffee cup, weighted down by his truck keys. Things about living at Peterson Farm, my own garden space. Ms. Peterson said I could. Learning about the solar panels, being closer to school, the big tree perfect for a swing, helping with science experiments, Dad looking happy again. The last item made his throat tight. He sat down heavily, coffee forgotten as he read it again. Emma emerged from her room, already dressed for school, watching him with a mix of hope and uncertainty. "I know you said we shouldn't get too excited," she said quickly. "But Ms. Peterson showed me the house yesterday after my science project work, and Dad, it has a real office space where you could draw building plans and—" "Emma," he interrupted gently, Come sit down. She slid into the chair across from him, hands clasped in her lap. Are you mad I made a list? No, sunshine, never. He smoothed the paper carefully. But this is a big decision. It would change everything. Maybe everything needs changing. She said it with such certainty that he looked up sharply. Like how you changed Mrs. Henderson's porch so she wouldn't be scared of falling anymore. James studied his daughter, seeing Sarah's directness in her gaze. When did you get so wise? Miss Peterson says I get it from you. Emma reached across the table, pointing to the last item on her list. You smile more there, Dad. Like in the yearbook pictures. The observation hit home. He thought of the job offer sitting in his desk drawer, of Sarah's words about bridges between past and future, of Emma's growing enthusiasm for the farm's possibilities. It's complicated, sunshine. Because you and Ms. Peterson used to love each other, the question caught him off guard. How did you... I saw the way you look at her, like how Mr. Rodriguez looks at Mrs. Rodriguez when she brings him lunch at the hardware store. Emma's face was serious. And she keeps your picture in her office. She what? In her drawer. I saw it when we were looking for markers. It's from the science fair, the one where she knocked over the display. Emma paused. She looks at it sometimes, when she thinks I'm busy with my project. James ran a hand over his face, overwhelmed by his daughter's perception. The morning sun streamed through their small kitchen window, highlighting the shabbiness of their rental house, the dreams they'd put on hold. Dad? Emma's voice was smaller now. Are you scared? The question stripped away his defenses. Yes, he admitted. Change is always scary. But you taught me scary things can be good, like when I learned to ride my bike or started new school. She pulled the list back, adding something at the bottom. Sometimes you have to be brave twice, once for trying and once for letting yourself be happy about it. James read the new edition. 7. Being a family. Maybe. The hope in those 3 words, the careful question mark, broke something open in his chest. He thought of Sarah in her grandfather's workshop, of shared coffee in the diner, of all the moments when the past and present seemed to blur into possibility. Miss Peterson said we don't have to decide right away, Emma offered. But I really want to help with the hydroponics rotation next month. James folded the list carefully, tucking it into his shirt pocket next to his heart. We'll see, he said, but his voice held less uncertainty than before. Emma's face brightened. She knew her father's tones, knew when we'll see meant hope rather than deflection. Can I tell Miss Peterson about my garden ideas, just in case? Finish your breakfast first, he said, but he was smiling now. And Emma, thank you for the list. She hugged him before running to get her backpack, leaving him alone with a cooling coffee cup and thoughts of second chances. The list crinkled. In his pocket, a paperweight of dreams and possibilities, of a future written in a child's hopeful hand. Sarah found the letter of rejection on her desk early morning, crisp white paper stark against her dark wooden desk. James's handwriting was as familiar as ever, neat, architectural in its precision. She read it twice, fingers pressed against her grandfather's watch before heading to the shed. He was there, as she knew he would be, methodically packing his tools. The roof repairs were complete, the drainage system tested. Their excuse for daily encounters was ending. No, she said simply, holding up the letter. James didn't turn around. Sarah, you don't get to do this again. Her voice shook slightly. You don't get to make decisions for both of us, not this time. That made him turn. I'm not. I'm making them for Emma, for her future, by denying her opportunities, by running from something that could give her everything you've worked for, by protecting her. The outburst seemed to surprise them both. James ran a hand through his hair, a gesture so familiar it made Sarah's chest ache. What happens when this falls apart? When the town's gossip turns cruel? When she gets hurt because I dared to reach for something I don't deserve? Sarah crossed the shed, stopping just out of arm's reach. From her pocket, she pulled out an envelope yellowed with age. I found this last night going through grandfather's things. It's from you, dated the day you left. James stared at the unopened envelope. You never got it. Grandfather did, the day you left it at the diner for me. She turned it over in her hands. He kept it all these years, never told me about it. Want to know what he wrote on the back? Without waiting for an answer, she showed him the faded pencil marks. Some hearts need time to grow strong enough for love. Sarah, you wrote that you weren't good enough, that I deserved better than a boy with no future, no prospects. She finally opened the letter, preserved words spilling out, that you couldn't ask me to wait while you pieced your family back together. I meant it then. I mean it now. No. Sarah stepped closer. You were wrong then, and you're wrong now. Do you know what I see when I look at you? I see a man who raised a brilliant daughter alone, who built a business from nothing, who still stops to help Mrs. Henderson even when she can't pay, because that's who you are. A handyman, he said bitterly. A fix-it man who never built anything lasting. You built Emma's world, made it safe, made it full of love. Sarah gestured to the shed around them. You rebuilt this place, not just with repairs, but with understanding. Everything you touch gets stronger. And what about you? James demanded. The successful CEO, the woman who transformed a family farm into an agricultural empire. How does a handyman fit into that world? The same way he always has, by seeing what's broken and making it whole again. She touched his arm gently. Including me. The contact seemed to break something in him. I'm scared, he admitted quietly. Not of failure. I know that old dance. I'm scared of hoping again, of letting Emma hope. Hope isn't a finite resource, James. It grows back stronger like winter wheat. She smiled slightly. Someone wise taught me that. From her pocket, she pulled out Emma's wish list. The original, not the copy James carried. Your daughter left this in my office. Look at the back. James turned the paper over. There, in Emma's careful writing, things that need fixing at the new house. Dad will know how. She believes in you, Sarah said softly. So do I. The question is, are you brave enough to believe in yourself? The morning sun streamed through the shed's new roof boards, casting patterns on the floor where they stood. Outside, the farm hummed with activity. Workers arriving, equipment starting up, another day of growth and possibility beginning. I'm not the same person I was, James said finally. Neither am I. Sarah touched her grandfather's watch. Maybe that's the point. Maybe we needed to become who we are to find our way back. The unopened letter from 15 years ago lay between them, a bridge between past and present. James picked it up slowly, feeling its weight. Some hearts need time, he read from the back. Grandfather was right, Sarah said. He usually was. She held out her hand. Stay. Not for me, not even for Emma. Stay, because you finally believe. You deserve to build something lasting. The morning light caught her face, and for a moment James saw everything. The girl she had been, the woman she became, the future they might build. All it would take was the courage to reach out and take her hand. The house stood at the edge of the orchard, its white clapboard siding catching the late afternoon sun. James and Emma stood in the front yard, their few boxes already moved in, while Sarah leaned against her truck, giving them space for this moment. It's bigger than our apartment, Emma whispered, clutching her science project binder. Do you think my garden can go there? She pointed to a sunny patch near the kitchen window. Perfect spot for it, James said, his hand on her shoulder. Southern exposure, good drainage. Miss Peterson said there used to be a garden there when her grandmother was alive. Emma looked back at Sarah. Did you help with that garden too, Dad, when you were young? I did. James met Sarah's eyes over their daughter's head. Your great-grandmother. Peterson taught me everything I know about tomatoes. Sarah pushed off from her truck, walking toward them with something in her hands. As she got closer, James recognized what it was, a framed photograph freshly taken. First picture in our new office, she said, holding it out. The image showed the three of them in front of the newly repaired shed, Emma between them. all smiling. It was a simple moment captured just that morning, but it held the weight of possibility. "Can we hang it beside the window?" Emma asked. "Where I'm going to put my microscope." "The office is your space to design," Sarah said carefully, looking at James. "Both of you." James took the photo, studying it. The shed in the background stood proud with its new repairs, a testament to things rebuilt. But it was their faces that caught his attention. Emma's unrestrained joy, Sarah's quiet contentment, his own surprise at finding happiness again. "I have something for the office too," Emma announced, pulling a paper from her binder. It was a new list titled "Things to Build Together." "When did you make this?" James asked, taking the offered paper. "Last night. Miss Peterson, Sarah, helped me with some of the ideas." Emma pointed to various items, like the greenhouse for my science experiments, and the workshop where you can teach me about building things, and the treehouse in the big oak tree. "Treehouse?" James looked at Sarah, who shrugged innocently. "You did say you wanted to build something lasting," she reminded him. "Besides, every good farmer needs a place to dream big dreams." Emma continued down her list, each item a blend of practical needs and childhood wishes. James listened, watching Sarah's face as she heard their daughter, and she was their daughter now, in all the ways that mattered, plan their future with such certainty. "And here," Emma said, reaching the last item, "is where we can put grandfather's workbench. Sarah said he'd want you to have it." James looked at Sarah sharply. The workbench had been Joe Peterson's pride, the heart of his workshop for decades. "He would have wanted it to stay in the family," Sarah said softly, her hand going to her grandfather's watch. "And it has." The word family hung in the air between them, full of meaning. Emma, with a child's perfect timing, chose that moment to spot a rabbit near her future garden space and dash off to investigate. "You're sure about this?" James asked, meaning everything: the house, the job, the future they were rebuilding piece by piece. Sarah stepped closer, taking his hand. "I learned something from watching you work," she said. "The strongest repairs are the ones that take time, that respect both what was broken and what can be. We're not fixing the past, James. We're building something new." He looked down at their joined hands, then at Emma examining her garden space with scientific precision, and finally at the house that waited to become a home. "Then we better get started," he said, squeezing her hand. "That tree house won't build itself." Sarah laughed, the sound carrying across their yard, and it was their yard now, their future, their second chance at getting things right. In his pocket, Emma's original wish list crinkled, its last item no longer carrying a question mark. They were becoming a family, not because of the past they shared, but because of the future they chose to build together. The Autumn Harvest Festival transformed Peterson Farm into a celebration of community and growth. Tables lined the space between the restored shed and the main barn, loaded with food brought by what seemed like half the county. Strings of lights twinkled overhead, turning the evening into something magical. James stood at the edge of the gathering, watching Emma proudly show off her hydroponics project to her science teacher. The system, built in her new greenhouse, had already produced its first crop of lettuce. Next to her display stood the architectural plans for the greenhouse, his first design project in 15 years, drawn in the office that now housed both his drafting table and her microscope. "Your daughter's quite the scientist," Betty from the diner said, appearing at his elbow with a piece of apple pie. "And quite the farmer too, from what I hear." "She comes by it honestly," James replied, accepting the pie. "Though I'm not sure if she gets it from her father's building sense or her—" He paused, then smiled. "Or Sarah's innovation. Both, I'd say." Betty patted his arm. "Some things are meant to be part of the same whole." Across the yard, Sarah was presenting the farm's new community education initiative. She'd transformed the old corn crib into a teaching space where local students could learn about sustainable agriculture. The keys to the building hung on her belt beside her grandfather's watch, old and new together. Mrs. Henderson's voice carried across the crowd. Just like a fairy tale, isn't it? The prodigal son returns. The farm girl becomes a success. Love conquers all. Not quite, Sarah said, joining James with her own piece of pie. Real life's messier than fairy tales. More interesting too. She was right. Their story wasn't a simple romance of reunited lovers. It was about growth and change, about learning to build something new from the foundations of the past, about a little girl's wish list becoming a blueprint for the future. Emma bounded over, excitement radiating from her face. "Dad! Sarah! Can I show everyone the treehouse, please? Mr. Wilson says he doesn't believe I helped design it." The treehouse had become their first family project, combining James's construction knowledge, Sarah's practical innovations, and Emma's boundless imagination. Its wooden walls held their shared fingerprints, quite literally in the painted handprints that decorated one wall. "Why don't you give them the tour?" Sarah suggested. "Show them how the solar-powered lights work." As Emma led a group of curious guests toward the old oak tree, James felt Sarah's hand slip into his. "Having second thoughts?" she asked quietly. "About the farm, the job, us? Any of it, all of it?" James looked around at the life they'd built in the past few months. The restored shed stood as a testament to things preserved. The new hydroponics building represented their future. And everywhere, in every repair and innovation, were touches of all three of them. His craftsmanship, Sarah's vision, Emma's enthusiasm. "No," he said finally. "No second thoughts, just gratitude for second chances." Sarah squeezed his hand, her grandfather's watch ticking softly at her hip. From the treehouse came the sound of Emma's voice, explaining the pulley system they'd designed together. "You know," Sarah said, "Grandfather used to say that the best farms grow more than just crops. They grow possibilities." Smart man. "He also said you were the only boy who ever looked at me the same way you looked at a perfectly designed building, like you were seeing all the potential inside." James turned to her, remembering the young dreamer she'd been, seeing the successful woman she'd become, treasuring both equally. "Your grandfather was right about a lot of things, including second chances, especially those." Above them, the harvest moon rose over Cedar Valley, casting its light on the gathered community, the restored buildings, the family they'd become. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, crops to tend, repairs to make, a future to build. But for now, they stood together in the autumn evening, listening to their daughter share their combined knowledge with the world. In James's pocket, Emma's original wish list had been joined by newer ones, each filled with dreams and plans, but he didn't need to read them anymore. The reality they'd built together was better than any list could capture. Some things, after all, didn't need fixing. They just needed time to grow into what they were always meant to be.